Hello, I'm Diana Reif, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival. I'd like to welcome our speakers, audience, and donors. If the past 4 to 18 months has taught us anything, it is that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or groundbreaking films, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It is no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. I hope that you enjoy all the events and that they make you think and dream afresh.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Kennedy Kennard, and I am a member of the Board of Trustees of the Charleston Literary Festival and of Spoleto Festival USA. It's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon for this conversation with the new Spoleto General Director, Mena Mark Hanna, led by Edward Hart, who is the Dean of the College of Charleston School of Arts. The conversation will focus on books that have inspired Mena over the years. But first, let's rewind. Mena was born in London of Egyptian immigrants in a household that spoke French, Arabic, and English. The family moved to the US when Mena was 2 years old and settled in New Jersey. He is a first-generation American of Coptic Egyptian descent. Mena was a young soprano in the Philadelphia Boys Choir. Performing at Carnegie Hall, the Sydney Opera House, and elsewhere. That experience provided him the opportunity to travel the world through the support of his family. Mena was also a cantor in the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is the minority Christian faith of Egypt and the religion he was brought up in. I've read that he discovered his love for music around the age of 9 through a fascination with Coptic chant. But his mother was his first musical influence. She was the director of their local church choir. He's a graduate of Temple University, summa cum laude, with a degree in music composition. He received his master's degree and PhD from Oxford, where he studied musicology, music composition, and critical writing. So Mena comes to Charleston from Berlin, where he was the founding dean and professor of musicology and composition at the Barenboim-Said Akademie, a music conservatory in Berlin. It's a relatively new conservatory, officially opening in 2017-2018. It provides musical tuition and humanities training to students all over the world, with a particular focus on students from the Middle East and North Africa. Before his positions at the Academy, he was assistant artistic director at the Houston Grand Opera. Mena and his wife Sarah, their 20-month-old son Hugo, and their dog Aggie arrived in Charleston just 3 weeks ago. And they're already immersing themselves in the community. In fact, Sarah has even discovered the sandwiches at Burbage's. It took me a year after I moved to Charleston to make that discovery. By the way, for those of you who aren't from Charleston, Burbage's is a small neighborhood corner grocery store. So, but put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that. So, Mena's been described as an arts administrator, musicologist, educator, and composer. Also, and I quote, he possesses deep knowledge and experience across artistic genres, and critically is passionate about the power of artistic expression to bridge differences and bring people together. Those are the words of Alicia Gregory, Spoleto board chair. So we're very fortunate to have Mena here in Charleston and with us this afternoon. We're also delighted to have Dean Hart with us. Edward Hart is the Dean of the School of the Arts and Professor of Music Theory and Composition at the College of Charleston. He's a composer, receiving many national and international commissions. Indeed, he was composer in residence of the Charleston Symphony for the 2019-2020 season. Dean Hart is a native Charlestonian. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from the College of Charleston, and he holds a master's degree and PhD from the University of South Carolina. Two interesting facts. First, one of his ancestors on his mother's side built pianos and harps in Paris before coming to the US and opening a music house on King Street in the early 1800s, so over 200 years ago. The business continued in the family until 1970. The second interesting fact, in an article published a few years back, Edward noted that he lived and raised his kids just yards from his mother's house where he grew up. Now, this is the interesting part. I quote, "For me, the quality of life is measured by the ability to walk my kids to Mr. Burbage's for a Coke." So I think there's some affinity here between the Hannas and the Harts. So finally, you'll recall that I mentioned that Mena, Sarah, and Hugo have a dog named Aggie. Well, Aggie's full name is Agatha Christie. So does that provide a clue to Mena's book choices? We'll find out. So please join me in welcoming Mena Mark Hanna and Dean Edward Hart. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction and surprising introduction. So Mr. Burbage's is great. So I've been looking forward to this for a lot of reasons. The main one really is this is the first time I've had a chance to meet and talk with Mena. So let me be the 1,000th person to say welcome to Charleston, and I'm really excited to see how the festival evolves under your leadership. So
I'm excited too.
Well, we all are. So we're both composers, and one might ask, what do composers read? Is it all books about music? And so, just speaking for myself, the answer is no. I mean, I do from time to time read about music, but I read about a lot of other things as well, and that's, of course, a sample size of one. But come to find out that Mena as well does not read always about music, quite the contrary. And while that's a sample size of 2, my gut tells me that's probably the case with composers everywhere. So I recently received the list of books that Mena wanted to talk about, and expecting a small handful, and we settled on 11, which we'll talk about thoroughly and in detail for the next 50 minutes. Well, some of these I knew, some of them I didn't. So what I wanted to do, and maybe struggled with a little bit, is putting them into categories or thematic categories, and Mena was actually very helpful with this. And so that's how we're going to do it. We're going to group these books. So I'm sure it is evident, or will soon be evident, that I am not an intellectual powerhouse like my friend here. I will talk about things through the lens of what I know, which is music. And so forgive me for always looking at it in that angle. That's just what I know best. So speaking of music, our first theme, our first category is novels and musical form. So just a very quick, musical form basically is what you do with your musical ideas. And so traditionally speaking, at least, it's determined by repetition, variation, and contrast. You get an idea, you repeat it, you change it, and then maybe do something else. More simply put is what you do and when you do it. And so I think maybe that people who write novels have to grapple with those same sort of ideas of how to shape a book. And so to that end, there are 2 books, The Sellout by Paul Beatty and Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Why don't you just tell us, firstly, why those books landed on this list, and then maybe we can talk about the form.
Thank you very much, Edward. And also thank you to Deborah for this thorough biographical introduction that took me quite by surprise. And also, I just want to say that I'm deeply humbled to be on this stage. The first time I was here was to see Jeff Nuttall's indefatigable and virtuosic presentation of chamber music here. And I feel humbled to be here talking about books, especially because I sort of feel like I don't really deserve a place at the Literary Festival. I think it's very generous for the Literary Festival to invite me to speak. If you scroll down the website, you see basically just covers of books and then my face, which is somewhat embarrassing. But I'm happy to be here nonetheless. So those 2 books are very near and dear to my heart. And in a way, what they're about musical form. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Paul Beatty's The Sellout. They're both about musical form, and they both kind of reflect musical form novelistically in similar ways. And I think Paul Beatty did that very intentionally in his book, The Sellout, which was, I think, won the International Man Booker Prize in 2017. But let's start with The Sellout by Ralph Ellison. The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Invisible Man is a book that's rooted in sort of the jazz age. It's set in the 1950s. It's extremely improvisatory. There are melodic lines that kind of fragment out of the book and then kind of weave back into the book. And I think it is very much reflective of hard bebop jazz. So you would think of things like the album Something Else by Cannonball Adderley with Miles Davis as well, or even Miles Davis's Birth of Cool, which happened a couple of years later. And this is kind of the sound world of Invisible Man. And as a matter of fact, he opens the book listening to this music. This music is very much rooted in the book itself. It's rooted in the character. It's how the character views himself. And the character views himself as an other, as a black man, through the lens of music. And as a black man growing up through various parts of the United States, ending up in the North, having origins in the South, through the lens of music, through jazz, and understanding his place in society through jazz. And the reason why that's so important to me is because it is inimitably American. It's one of these books that I read, too, and this will be a recurring theme, I think, when I was studying in graduate school in Oxford, and I was trying to figure out who I was. I'm an Egyptian guy that's born in London, that grew up in New Jersey. What is my culture? Where do I belong? And invariably, I kept coming back to American novels and American music because I am culturally and, in terms of my perspective, American. I even watch football and basketball. Like, I am American. And that became very apparent to me when I was decidedly not in the United States, when I was in the UK, when I was in Oxford, which is a place that is its own bubble world, has its own heritage, its own sense of preservation and priority that is also rooted out in England's preeminent position as a colonial power for the last 250 plus years, and is the oldest university that is still functioning, or whatever line they use to describe themselves, but also an incredibly elite and prestigious university to be at, where I felt like I didn't belong there. So for me to kind of go back to Ralph Ellison and actually go back to jazz was how I found a way to center myself. And it's a book that I think was deeply provocative, because it's not just about being American, but it's about trying to fit in America when you also aren't really how America defines itself. At least the character in Invisible Man, the whole idea is that he is invisible to society, that he is not seen by society because he is a black man. And this is something, I think, that is related to Paul Beatty's book, The Sellout, which is a wildly provocative book. It's about a man in modern-day Los Angeles who decides that he is going to how does one put this? It's provocative, so I'm warning you. He is going to re-enter the world of bondage and slavery and do it voluntarily. And he does that in order to push back against certain things that are happening in Los Angeles. Rampant expansion, rampant gentrification of his area, which is this old part of south central Los Angeles that still has farms and still has orchards where he could still produce watermelons. And he does this through an incredibly sharp, cutting language. And that's how both of these books are connected. They reflect in their language the musical form that they are going back to. So Ralph Ellison reflects in the language, in the narrative of the book, jazz and bebop jazz. And you can sort of find this language, this way that he speaks, the way that he writes, the way that the character talks, kind of going off, and then sort of improvising on itself and improvising on its themes, and then kind of going back into a larger narrative structure. And Paul Beatty does this, but instead of looking at jazz, he looks at hip-hop. And you find this kind of mechanic, mathematical precision, this rhythm that punctuates, staccato-like, in the work itself, in the novel itself, the character's elocution, the character's phrasing. So they're both books that are not about music, but are kind of rooted in music and about music at the same time. And also, Paul Beatty's book is the only book I've ever read, really, of a certain literary stature that mentions Coptic chant. So for me, I was just like, this guy is speaking my language.
So I wonder, one of the things that we talk about in form and composition is pace, the pace of things. When something needs to happen, how it's developed, and the pace at which it's developed. And I'm curious, as a reader and as a composer, do you ever wonder about how our collective sense of time has started to change based on these things and television? And so, and I think about that in my music. I'd love to do this Mahler-sized piece where it takes a long time to evolve, but I don't think I've got time. You better get right to it and say what you got to say. Do you think about that at all?
Yeah, I think this is a discussion that my wife and I have often, especially about the phones, and how these devices are kind of warping our minds. It's not. It is. I don't know if it's intentional. I don't really know what Mark Zuckerberg's angle is, but calling his company Meta, based on metaverse, is a very weird thing to do, considering the origin of the term metaverse, which is, it originates in a 1990s dystopian novel about people being sucked into a virtual reality, which recreates the same sort of hegemonic structures that exist in reality that they're trying to escape. So it's a really weird term to use, but in a way, that's where we're headed. We're headed to a place where we are cut off from reality, and that's happening all over the place. That's happening in our discourse as a society. That's happening culturally. That's happening at the dinner table. That's happening politically, and we are cut off from reality, and we're not able to have conversations. And I think this is also what is happening to even things like the New York Times have to sort of bow to this pressure, where they have to create headlines that just attract people's attention so people can click on it. It's all about this kind of schizophrenic energy that exists because of these devices and because of this technology. And oftentimes you see, in the course of human history, and the historian Eric Hobsbawm writes about this in his big sort of quartet of books on the 18th century to the modern age, you see that humanity is catching up to its technological innovations. So we have this famously happened in World War I, where the strategies of warfare were not congruous with the technologies of warfare. So you just had people running up against each other and being machine gunned down completely uselessly, and there was no movement of the battle lines at all. And we're seeing this again being perpetrated today with technology. We have not come up with strategies, politically and socially and culturally, to deal with this technology. And I think some people are starting to warn us about the havoc it wreaks in our everyday lives, and also the havoc it wreaks in our systems. There's a famous book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism. She's a phenomenal professor at Harvard. And the book is really about how these devices are turning the system that we exist in against us by constantly tracking every single thing we do, and that these companies that we have created are predicated upon a successful procurement of this data. And we can't even control it. Like, it's just this crazy malignant growth that exists. And so we haven't come up with ways to sort of push back against this. Personally, the way I try to push back against it a little bit is I sort of engross myself in like very, very, very serious, turgid, long literature. and you're going to see that in some of the books that we discuss. I'm not a very good light reader, and I'm not a very quick reader. I just sort of engage with big books. And I think it's a way that I escape from this as well. And the problem with that sometimes is that sometimes I don't read very often, because that's so much, it expends so much energy to do that. But of course, it's just one personal strategy, I suppose.
So our next category is art, nature, and society. And the books, I'll just read the titles and let you talk about them really briefly, and then we'll circle back. Ministry of the Future, a book of American martyrs, Joyce Carol Oates, Heart of Darkness, and Moby Dick.
Yeah, all very serious books. Big, long books. So Ministry for the Future is by Kim Stanley Robinson. It came out at the end of 2019 into 2020. A Book of American Martyrs is by Joyce Carol Oates. And of course, Moby Dick, Herman Melville, and Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. So let's start with Joyce Carol Oates, actually. A Book of American Martyrs. This book is a very long book, like between 500 and 600 pages. It's a book that I picked up in the airport before Sarah and I went on our honeymoon, and it's a book. It's a book about two American families. One is a doctor one family centers around a doctor who works in clinics like Planned Parenthood and provides emergency care to women who need to have abortions. And the other one is a man from Ohio and his family, the Voorhees, I believe. And he is a man who speaks in this chilling language that's a combination of like Psalmodic biblical language and modern day colloquialisms of the Midwest. And I sort of think only Joyce Carol Oates can kind of write in this way. It really sucks you in. And this man takes it upon himself to murder the doctor in this kind of whipped up fervor of the anti-abortion moment and movement in the United States. And so the reason why the book is so interesting to me is that it really is about the collision of belief systems. And it's about how these two cultures that exist within the same country can't talk to each other at all. They use different languages. They use different reasoning systems. And one is so predicated, it's so rooted in ancientness, in a patriarchy that does not want to move, that does not want to advance, that is stubbornly, trenchantly rooted in the past and is rooted in male whiteness. And the other one comes from a world of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and intellectualism and medicine and doctors that can't really understand the ancientness, can't really understand the tradition, the patriarchy, the preservation of the past. And it's an awful collision. And of course, it's metered out through the most violent means necessary, because that is the story of this nation. This is a very, very, very violent nation. And this book is about that. It's about guns. It's about violence. It's about how we have these discussions as a society. And unfortunately, that's what the book sort of kind of goes unabashedly forward into. And yeah, so I read that book on our honeymoon. And it was not an easy book to read on our honeymoon. I think Sarah managed to finish 7 books while I was reading this one book. And at one point, I was like, this book is after 10 days into the honeymoon, I was like, I need a break. It's too much. I can't move forward into this book. And so, those little libraries where you have take a book, leave a book. And so I walked by, we're on this island in Greece, it's beautiful, I'm surrounded by all this beautiful nature, and then I get into this book and it's so horrible. I mean, beautifully written and incredibly engrossing, but also quite horrible. And so I got a book out, and it was a book by John Grisham, and I'm like, oh, finally, a respite from the madness. I can just read something light. And of course, it was about a rape. So I quickly finished that book, and then I went back to a Book of American Martyrs. And I really didn't have a break, but the honeymoon was beautiful. And so this is a book I think that it's trying to grapple with our society. And I think sometimes, Joyce Carol Oates does it in a very blatant manner that is not elegant. It's not meant to be elegant. And I think she confronts the ugliness of our society.
Right. So, we titled this section Art, Nature, and Society, but I wonder if we couldn't turn that on its head just a little bit and think about it more as art as a reflection of our society and or nature. So, obviously, what you just described is a reflection of our current society, what's happening now, whereas you might think that the other two of the other books, Heart of Darkness and Moby Dick, is more a reflection of human nature, and that even though they're 19th century books, we're still dealing with the same problems found in human nature and some of the literal same problems that are encountered in those books.
Yeah, very much so. And actually, before we jump into them, I do want to talk about Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future, very quickly. So this book, because it's an extension as well of the world of Moby Dick and what that beckons. But Ministry for the Future is, I think, the term that people describe it now is called climate fiction or cli-fi. It's Kim Stanley Robinson is a science fiction writer, but it's so close to our current reality and what's happening now and what will happen in the next 50 years that it doesn't really feel like it's science fiction. It feels much closer to reality than that. And so this book, The Ministry for the Future, is about the United Nations coming together in response to the Paris Climate Accords and finding a way to come up with an agency to advocate and litigate on behalf of future human lives. And future, not just human lives, future lives in general, animal lives, lives in nature, etc. And so they create this ministry that has a long name that I can't remember. And it's called colloquially the Ministry for the Future, and it's set in Zurich, in Switzerland. The book, and I'm going to say this blatantly, and if Kim Stanley Robinson finds out, it's okay, it doesn't have a lot of literary merit. It's not a book where you enjoy the language. It's not like Ralph Ellison or Paul Beatty or Joyce Carol Oates. It's much more about systems and processes. And it's about how we can, as a humanity, come up with the right systems to protect this earth and, as a matter of fact, continue in our humanness, continue as a race, continue as a species on this planet. And so he's all-encompassing in this. He talks about how the climate crisis will affect our economic system, what kind of economic systems can exist around this. He talks a lot about geoengineering. He talks a lot about climate and eco-terrorism. He talks a lot about our political and governmental systems and how they would adjust in a future that really grapples with climate change. Like I said, not a lot of light reading. And it's a fascinating book because it really is a work of fiction, but it's also so steeped in a close reading of all of these systems. He's a man who understands these systems. He got his PhD under Frederick Jameson, and I think at Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, or UC Berkeley, something like that. And he really understands the political and economic sides of these systems. And it's a good and important read because of that. At one point, I was very closely following Ezra Klein's podcasts on Vox and also on the New York Times, and he would often come up and talk about books that he's read, and he often also interviews people, and he says, "What are your 3 favorite books?" And then he had an interview with Kim Stanley Robinson, and he said, "This is the most important book that I've read this year," so I picked it up. That was basically it. I picked it up and I read it, and it is a very important book to read. It's just it's really about imagining what the future of humanity could be, and not necessarily imagining what that would be like on a person-to-person or in a literary world. But that's also related to Moby Dick. Moby Dick is, if someone were to ask me, what do you think is the first book about global capital? I would say Moby Dick. It's a book written in the 19th century, which ostensibly is about whaling and effectively is also about a man's need to conquer nature in that man's most, and of course I'm talking about Captain Ahab, most all-encompassing, most almost infuriatingly stubborn sense. And Moby Dick does so in such a fascinating way. You know, there is something that ties a lot of these works together, and I think it's something that I also have intrinsically inside of my personality. They're all works that are kind of OCD. They're all works that are really, really, really obsessive compulsive, and I think I'm a little bit like that. You know, as a kid, I was really into like long board games like Dungeons and Dragons and like long video games and like big strategic worlds where, you know, they're not really entertainment. It's like spreadsheets and like doing math. I mean, that was really the sort of thing that really got me excited as a child. And this is also how I look at this literature. I mean, you know, there are pages upon pages of Moby Dick devoted to knots, how different knots work, and how you hold ships together with knots. There's a chapter on one single color. I mean, there's a fascinating obsession with it. But if you zoom out from that obsessiveness, what you see is humanity grappling with nature. And the end result of that is Ministry for the Future. That's how those two books are related. But there's also another side, and this is how we get into Heart of Darkness. The other side of me as a kid was far-off, far-flung adventure. I think, you know, all of us probably read Robinson Crusoe and these sort of books, Swiss Family Robinson, etc., that were about us trying to escape. At least I did, and I think it probably had to do with my own ill at ease with myself, my own sense of self being ill at ease with the world around it. And so I constantly tried to find books that were about escape. And Heart of Darkness, which I read in high school, is the first book that I read which really is about European colonization. And it's also about seafaring adventures, even though it's also quite brutal in how it describes it. I think that these are very masculine worlds. You know, this is the 19th century world of the sea. This is about 19th century capitalism. And these are worlds that didn't have a lot of female energy or female characters. And there were worlds that were about savagery and worlds about what that savagery meant from a European perspective, especially in Heart of Darkness. I think one of the things that people often forget about Joseph Conrad is that he himself was an immigrant. He was Polish. He wasn't British. He was Polish, and he ended up in the UK. He ended up in England as a sea merchant. And this book is, to a certain degree, based on his own experience and the experiences of others around him. And it was only after I read Heart of Darkness and then read Edward Said's work, Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, and I think we'll get to Said a bit later, that I understood that this book and this work was about European power and was about imperialism, and that this book was about enriching small European kingdoms like Belgium at the cost of monumental human degradation and violence in Africa.
So speaking of light reads and light topics, our next category is loss, trauma, and collective memory. So
I almost spat out my drink. Sorry.
So before I read the titles, one thing I was wrestling with that category is that, you know, loss and trauma seem to be fairly simple, dark, but simple kind of concepts. Collective memory is more complicated, I think. And maybe before we even go in there, maybe you can just sort of set the ground rules of what your you're talking about here in collective memory?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is there's kind of some theory behind these titles, and it's a bit about inherited trauma as well, in addition to collective memory, and there are some scholars who write on this stuff that I think are very interesting that are alive right now. Sarah Ahmed is a scholar that writes a little bit about this sort of work, and I think what's behind this is understanding that the experiences of our forebearers, the experiences of our parents and their parents, so on and so forth, impact our everyday life and impact our own personal experience. As a matter of fact, actually, the one scholar who I think writes about this most successfully, at least for me, in my own personal experience, is, again, Edward Said. And he talks about the experience and trauma of exile. In an essay by Edward Said called Reflections on Exile, he describes exile as being contrapuntal. And counterpoint is a musical term. It's about two voices, two lines of melody that are melodically independent, yet harmonically and rhythmically interdependent. They sort of lock in together. You hear it. No pianos here, but you hear it in a lot of Bach, in a fugue, for example. And he applies that to the life of exile, and sort of he says our lives are contrapuntal. We have the experience of our past, the experience of our forebearers, as one voice of counterpoint. We have our present-day experience as another voice of counterpoint. And we have a future we're working toward, potential, as a third voice of counterpoint. And that gives us a deep richness as exiles, but it also can give us a lot of sadness. And when I say exile, too, I don't want to exclusively use that term to denote it in the ancient practice of banishment, as in someone from this country is banished and moved to another country, or from this land to another land. I think the idea of exile and collective trauma is also about wealth. It's about property. It's about bondage. It's about how we deal with our past and how that bleeds into the present. And all of that comes into these works. It's certainly for Europe, a lot of that trauma, especially since Sarah and I have been living in Berlin for the last 7 years, was around the violence centered in Berlin over the last 50 years, especially recently with the Stasi and the city being split in two between East and West. But of course, before that, World War II and the Holocaust. So there is, when you're there, and even here, you feel steeped sometimes in that trauma, and it's around you. And so I think these set of works try to deal with that.
So let's talk about the works. I'll read the titles and let you talk about them. Exterminate All the Brutes, The Rings of Saturn, Decolonizing the Mind, and On Late Style, which I know is important to you.
Yeah.
So take...
Exterminate All the Brutes is a book by Sven Lindqvist, and it's actually also related to Rings of Saturn in a certain way. Kind of going back to my fascination of far-flung places, Sven Lindqvist writes a book that is basically a travel log. He tries to retrace the steps that happen in Joseph Conrad's book, Heart of Darkness, and he does it by going into deep South Sudan and Mali, and then eventually trying to get to Congo in the early 90s. And the title of the book, Exterminate All the Brutes, is from Heart of Darkness. It's I think something that is said toward the end of the book. And it's about traveling from a European perspective into this land that is so deeply connected with European wealth and power, but also trying to understand how, one single man who is not Belgian, but Swedish, can come to terms with his larger understanding and his larger guilt, his larger challenges of being European in this continent. And he's a very, very good writer. It's a really interesting book. The other side of this, of course, is Sebald. And Sebald is another one of those writers that I read in graduate school. This book, specifically, The Rings of Saturn, is about Sebald walking along the west coast of England. He was a German writer living in England, teaching at the University of East Anglia. He died in a tragic accident when he was, I think, in his early 50s or late 40s in 2001 or 1999. So these are books that are set in recent history in the 90s. And Sebald writes in this highly evocative manner, walking through the west coast of England and sort of reflecting upon everything that happened in those places historically and all of his own personal knowledge of those places. And then he couples these sort of reflections that are written in the most beautiful language possible. I really love Sebald's writing, with strange, blurry photographs of things that happen and things that he sees. So for example, as he's walking through the west coast of England, he walks past a very well-known manor country home that was owned by the Fitzgerald family. And the Fitzgerald family is an old English family that is related to the Irish Protestant ascendancy in Ireland and owned a lot of property in Ireland. And one of the members of this family, Edward Fitzgerald, was a shut-in. He was a recluse, and he spent his entire life working on one translation of one book by the Persian poet Omar Khayyam called El-Rubaiyat, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And he kept retranslating it and retranslating it and retranslating it. Like, he produced 5 different volumes of this. And Sebald describes him working on it while he is walking past his home and while there's a blurred out picture of the manor country home. So there's something very evocative and strange about it, and it's hallucinatory, it's vertiginous, you don't know what's fact, you don't know what's fiction, and it's just a trip. I mean, it's phenomenal. And he does this in other books. He does this in The Emigrants, and he does this in Austerlitz. And in those books particularly, they're capstones of the 20th century. They're talking about the collective memory and trauma of the Holocaust and of World War II. The last 2 books, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, is about how an African writer manages to write in a hegemonic European language, the language of his colonizer. So for Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is from Kenya, he was writing in English. And then he realized at a certain point that he could not write in English anymore. He realized as a boy, he describes himself as a boy in school reading Charles Dickens, which is about rainy London, which is so far divorced from his own experience in Nairobi as a child growing up. And he thought, I need to write my own literature. We need to create our own canon. We need to create our own works. And so this book, Decolonizing the Mind, is his goodbye to the English language. And after that point, he starts to write in Gikuyu, which is a African language spoken by the Bantu people of Kenya. And it was a book that I read this book relatively recently, in the last 5 years. It's very influential on me in how I think of music and how I think of art. Because I think this is a point now where we create our own work. We create our own reality. We tell our own stories as people that have not had a chance to tell those stories. So that's what's exciting about that. And then also about Edward Said, about On Late Style. So Said himself, Edward was a big figure in my life as a scholar, and I know his family quite well. Unfortunately, I never got to meet him personally. He died in 2003. And he's sort of the father of post-colonialism, and he writes about all of this work which is creating and underpins the European hegemony of the 19th century, either through academic collection of material or through description of other lands, like Heart of Darkness. And he kind of goes away from that in On Late Style, and this is why I like it so much. On Late Style is all about how things change when you are just looking at death's door, when you're just at the very end of life, and how artists have changed at that moment. And he has an incredible chapter about Beethoven's late period. And it's also a little bit about Adorno's late period. And in this chapter, it's about Beethoven sort of stubbornly, defiantly doing what Beethoven does, which is completely fragmented, and he didn't really care if anybody liked it or not. He just wrote these quartets that no one understood. And in a way, what Beethoven does harmonically in these quartets, it anticipates Wagner, it anticipates Debussy. It's not really done again for another 50 years or so, as I'm sure you know. And so Said's writing of this is also very, very personal because it was his last book. It was his late style, and it's about his late struggle. And so it's a book that I did a whole festival on this book in Berlin, and it's a book that's close to my heart.
So the last category, finally, we are going to lighten up a little bit. This is my title. I'll take it. When I'm not on the clock. And we have 2 entries here. Sarah's Binder of Recipes and poems by Elizabeth Bishop, Eugenio Monta, and Wallace Stevens.
Let's start with the recipes.
We were talking about that just a minute ago.
Yeah,
Cooking.
I love cooking, and I'm sure some of you know. You've heard me maybe say a few things about this before. Cooking is a big part of my life. It's a big part of what I grew up in. My father's a phenomenal cook. He's Alexandrian. It's a big part of heritage and understanding our past, and also celebrating joy and love that we have for each other. Because it's about sharing. It's sharing something that you create and then you ingest it. I mean, there cannot be. It's a great gesture of love. And Sarah, in this great gesture of love, once when I think it must have been for my 35th birthday, got in touch with all my friends and family and asked them secretly behind my back to submit their favorite recipes. And for my, some people, like for my father, they were personal recipes, like a kofta recipe or a cheese dip recipe that he sort of wrote down. And it's really interesting because I would call my dad up and I would be like, Dad, how do I make this kofta? And he's like, yeah, you just throw some cumin in. And I'll be like, well, how much cumin? He's like, just guess it. A little bit of cumin, just throw it in. And he would never tell me. And he'd just put a bit of turmeric in, and I would put a little bit of garlic powder in, stuff like that. And he'd never tell me. And then what Sarah did was that she sort of forced him to write down the recipe. And he still kind of wrote it in an improvisatory manner and never really said, put half a teaspoon of cumin, which is what I wanted. I wanted sort of a more analytical description of how to make that recipe. So it's something that I go back to a lot. It's right now it's in the middle of the Atlantic on a shipping container. Once it gets there, I will happily refer to that book and cook for the family with those recipes. The poems are something that I just love. I love reading poetry. I love reading poetry in different languages. As a composer, I set a lot of poems. I set one poem by Montale, Eugenio Montale, this Italian poet, about Venice, which was called La Gondola. It's the gondola that glides in a harsh tar and poppy glare. It sort of describes almost musically the gondola pushing against the dark currents of the canals. And I also love the kind of abstractions of American modernists like Elizabeth Bishop and like Wallace Stevens.
Do you think I've thought about this a lot, in terms of literary genres, poetry may be closest to what we do in music because it is not bound to reality as much? I mean, there's maybe more abstraction in the same way notes are abstract.
Yeah, I think poetry has an emotional immediacy that music also has, and I think that's a nice way to describe it and think of it, because it's really hard to describe music and write about music. There's a famous line that is sometimes, I think, ascribed to the French critic Hart, and I'm not sure if that's correct, but he says writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And and I mean, I've written a lot about music, and there are different ways to write about music, and some of the language is oftentimes not effective in describing the music. And I think that's true of poetry. It's hard to describe poetry linguistically, and it's hard to describe music linguistically.
So we have a few minutes. Forgive me for, I'm not checking my text, I promise. I'm just trying to keep us on schedule. We have a few minutes for some questions from you for Mena. I don't know if we do this by some raising hands. I think I can see most of you.
I'm really a light and easygoing person. I'm sorry it was such a forbidding conversation.
Oh, is there a microphone there? Great. Okay, terrific. Yeah, I think yeah, listen.
So what are you reading right now?
Ooh, very good question. I am reading a book, En finir avec Eddie, The End of Eddie, by Edouard Louis. And it's about a guy named Eddie Bellegueule, who comes from an impoverished town in northern France, who, and I'm going to use Sarah's words. Sorry, Sarah. It's confrontational literature. He writes extremely honestly and openly about his life as a person born into poverty, as a gay person born into poverty in northern France, and it's oh God, it's unbelievably, it's incredible to read. It's also so economically written. You know, he does not waste a word. It's a really good book. And Sarah knows his literature a bit better. So if you meet us afterward, you can talk to her more. Sarah's the more literary minded of the two.
So we had, I think, another one in the second row, maybe?
Yeah, right.
Oh, and one in the first row? Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Hello. Welcome to Charleston.
Thank you.
What influences you when you're selecting books? Like if you're in an airport and you're trying to pick up a book. I mean, what is going to be, we know that you have a dog named after Agatha Christie, so we want to know what your favorite Agatha Christie book is.
Man in the Brown Suit.
Okay, there you go. So, but what draws you, or what do you find intriguing when you're faced with books, for instance, in an airport bookstore trying to get something on the go? What's going to motivate you to pick up a book?
First of all, I say Man in the Brown Suit because it's the only Agatha Christie I've ever read, embarrassingly. What goes into how a lot of it is a lot of books are, I read reviews. Like I like reading The New Yorker. I try to read the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and read some of the articles in there. And so they inform some of the books that I'm interested in. I talk to friends. I am sometimes on Twitter. And sometimes on Twitter people have some suggestions that I look into. A lot of it is also like knowing a little bit sort of the profile of the author. So like, sometimes it's a nice experiment to try to read a lot of people who have been in the running for the Man Booker Prize, stuff like that. But I don't know. I don't really know what compels me to pick one book over the other. I mean, I like Joyce Carol Oates. I've read Joyce Carol Oates, and I thought this would be a cool book to read when I picked it up in the airport. I didn't really expect it to be so brutal. I like Colm Tóibín. I've read Colm Tóibín, so I'll continue to read his books too. So it's also about having like a personal relationship with feeling a personal relationship with some of those authors. And I mean, I have to say, like, there's so much that I still need to read by like, I haven't read much Thackeray or Trollope, and I guess one day I have to get around to them. So there's that too.
So I think we have time for one more quick one. Yes, please.
Yes. Oh, good. The microphone is working. I had a professor tell, this is about Moby Dick, okay? I had a professor tell me that Moby Dick was simply the greatest novel in the language, and it was about everything except whaling. And you sort of got into that a little bit. And so I guess I'm going to ask a question about the larger things that Moby Dick was about.
That's a nice way to describe it.
And-
I stay away from definitive declamations because, yeah, but I do think it's one of the best novels in the language for sure. Moby Dick is deeply about man's relationship with nature, and also what that means effectively for the planet. It's also very much about global capital, and how man's wish to bend nature to its will is about global capital. And in a way, it's extremely prescient because of that. You know, it's a book that really sort of sees what's happening around the corner. And one of the things that I hate more than anything in life are adaptations of Moby Dick. So once I subjected Sarah's family to a film version of Moby Dick, I think called The Whale or The Boat, that came out a couple of years ago, and it was woefully upsetting to me. And like, unfortunately, I'm going to say this, and you'll know that it's a piece that we'll never program at Spoleto, but there's an opera based on Moby Dick, and I think when you take such a book and you try to distill it into lines that work in an opera, you lose the book. That's it. So adaptations of Moby Dick, they don't work. Stay away from it.
Well, I think we could probably sit here and talk the rest of the afternoon. Unfortunately, they're probably going to give me the hook here in a moment. But let me say that I've enjoyed our conversation greatly, and I look forward to many more, and perhaps we'll meet at Mr. Burbage's at some point. So thank you all.
Thank you.